Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's presentation. It's Florida Supernature. This will be the last of our series of these web-based live presentations. We've got some new ideas coming down the pike for later this summer. We'll probably take a week off and retool and then come back with something very different going forward. Today's presentation, Florida native ferns. I am James Stevenson. I'm with the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences Extension Services here in Pinellas County. We are a partnership with our local government, Pinellas County, and we're referred to as the Extension Services. We extend research-based information to the citizens of our county. Each county has an extension office, and we provide information for free so that people can make decisions in their lives that don't have expensive problems for our local government to clean up, like using fertilizer properly, using the right plants, this sort of thing. We also do a lot of human-based extension work as well, things like diabetes management, home economics, these kinds of things that, again, prevent the need for expensive social services. Coming to you today from beautiful Brooker Creek Preserve. We are the largest preserve in Pinellas County. We are 9,000 acres of undeveloped Pinellas County. That's upland and freshwater wetland that has not been built on, which is an anomaly here in our built-out county. So if you haven't come to visit us in Brooker Creek Preserve, please do. We have 5 miles of trails that are still open and an education center, which in good times is open Thursday to Sunday. For now, you can come and pick up lots of information, lots of mobile information. You can do some self-guided tours, these kinds of things. All that kind of educational material can be found around the buildings known as the Environmental Education Center. So today's subject, native ferns of Florida. A lot of the information in today's presentation has come from personal experience. I've worked here at Brooker Creek for about 8 years. I've been working with plants pretty much all my life. So I've had the great privilege of working, honestly, all over the world with different kinds of plants from you name it. Ferns are a particularly interesting group to me. They're an odd group of land plants. They represent some very old ones. So a lot of today is going to come from personal experience and observation. More information has come from the only book that I know of that is specific to this group of plants, specific to our state, our funny state with the temperate panhandle, the kind of mid-zone central Florida area where we're slightly temperate, slightly tropical, and the fully tropical south. So with those 3 distinctive climatic zones, we have 3 very different populations of ferns. So our central Florida ferns, in particular our Pinellas County ferns, can all be found right here in Brooker Creek. Many of the photographs are from the Atlas of Florida Vascular Plants. This is a wonderful reference from the University of South Florida. This is a reference of all the plants that have ever been discovered, natural, unnatural, native in their own habitats or naturalized, not native, but reproducing in the wild in Florida, both invasive, non-invasive, native and non-native. All the plants that have been documented in Florida can be found with photographs and distribution ranges at this atlas, the Florida Plant Atlas from USF. So a lot of the photographs came from there. What I'd like to do today, if it suits you all, is look at basic fern biology. Like, what is a fern? Like, you're interested in ferns. You signed up for today's class. How many people do we have right now? I can't even see, but quite a few people signed up today for to learn something about ferns. We have 60 people on right now who wanted to learn something about ferns. So what are they to start? Just as with any discipline, botany has its vocabulary, and within botany, we've got fern words, terminology and a vocabulary that is almost specific to ferns. So we'll bore you with that just a little bit. So you can, if you're reading about this group of plants later on, you will at least have been exposed to it this once. Some identification techniques. A lot of people might come to our wetland, our freshwater wetland, and see this myriad of ferns. And I know they're ferns, but which is which? Well, we'll talk about some ways of some characteristics that might help you identify and then remember that identification, because that's what's more important, not just what's special about this fern, but how am I going to remember that? We've got at least 15 different species of ferns that we know of here at Brooker Creek, which again is the most diverse flora of upland and freshwater wetland in the county. And then it says we're going to observe some of these species in the field. So what we, in the person of all of us watching today, are going to be charged with going out and finding some of these things in their natural and sometimes non-natural habitats. So if that suits, I haven't seen anybody drop out yet, but if that suits, that's how we're going to proceed today. If you do have questions, comments, complaints, or concerns, if you want to just jot those down, my email address will be available at the end. Also, you can just start sending them to this email address here, my UF email address, if you have questions or comments. Obviously, won't be able to answer them right on the spot, but I promise I'll get back to you with those answers as soon as I can. Hopefully, I'll explain enough that there won't be too many. So what we're going to look at, what's a fern, the vocabulary, the words that are associated with the specialized leaf, which in ferns is called the frond, some identifications, the ferns of Brooker, and then we're going to invite you to your favorite natural area to take a stroll in a reasonable time of day to observe some of these in the wild. So let's start with what is a fern. And as I mentioned, a casual stroller in a natural area or a park or even just kind of around your neighborhood might see a plant and you could identify that as a fern. It looks like a fern. It's got these leaves. They're kind of feathery. They never flower. They've got these weird things on the underside of their leaves. But what botanically makes a fern a fern? Don't glaze over. We're going to get to the really good stuff, but I've got to give you this overview. Within the world of plants, all the plants on land, we have these very, very simple things. They hardly get off the surface of the land at all. They don't have any plumbing. They don't have any vascular system. They don't have roots. They just need the rainwater to kind of wash over them, and they reproduce by spores. These are the little velvety green mosses, not much to them. A little bit more complex structure, the development of root stems and leaves. We still have this very ancient lineage of plants. They still reproduce by spores. These are the ferns. This is the group that we're going to be looking at today. Other plant classes that we've taught address the plants, the seed plants, those plants that reproduce using this wonderful thing called a seed that's got all the food and the embryo ready for the next generation. That comes after these little things called the ferns. The seed plants are the conifers and the flowering plants that produce their seeds within a nice structure that helps to disperse those wonderful things called seeds. But so today we're looking at the ferns. Okay, that's the group we're going to look at. They're not as simple as mosses. They're not as complex as the seed plants. So what is it about ferns that make them ferns? It's their life cycle and the different structures that are involved in their life cycle. We're not going to go over this right now because it's kind of scary. We're not going to, again, has anyone left? No. We're going to try and keep you around by not scaring you off right away. But we're going to cover what makes a fern on the botanical level a few slides on. If you were to ask a kid, what is a drawing of a fern? You might get something like this, kind of a feather-shaped thing. But ferns can be very, very different from one another, and they can kind of fly in the face of what you might think a fern looks like. Remember, it's all about this life cycle and the structures that are involved in this life cycle. So here's a schematic picture of a fern that might have been, drawn by maybe a high school kid. Uh, but here's a couple of ferns that don't really look like ferns. Not only do they not look like ferns, they're not really found in situations where you would normally find ferns. This is a fern, this paddle-shaped leaf here with these egg beater shaped scales. Each one of those clear little hairs is actually shaped like an egg beater. Do you know what I'm talking about when I say egg beater? Those wire whisk things poking up into the air. And this one that just looks like little scales. These are two different species of fern that float on the surface of water. These are some of the plants that are often referred to as duckweed because they're free-floating, almost microscopic plants, but they're true ferns based on those reproductive parts. So that's what is a fern, how they reproduce despite what they look like. What is not a fern? Something like this beast that if you're unfortunate enough to have climbing around in your sphere of influence, as I like to call, if you have a yard or a churchyard or a schoolyard or wherever you're allowed to pull weeds, if you've ever encountered what's referred to as the climbing fern or air fern, I think it's called, or fern vine. It has a cousin. This is actually an asparagus. Yes, just like the kind that you eat. The asparagus fern, it also is called. These are not ferns. Asparagus, this plant, and the one previous, they are flowering plants, and they're invasive, exotic flowering plants. And being flowering plants, if you'll recall, they produce a seed, and flowering seeds put their seeds inside of a fruit, and the fruit of these two species are delicious to birds who take the fruit, deposit them in the woods, and then we have weeds coming up all over. Asparagus ferns are not ferns. They just aren't. Let's carry on with some of the vocabulary associated with ferns. The fern words. We'll start with frond. Now, frond is just kind of a fancy name for leaf. Palms are also allowed to use the word frond. I don't exactly know what the etymology of frond is, but we refer most often to fern leaves as fronds. The frond itself can be described by its component parts. The frond has a part that's called the blade, and the blade is that part of the frond that contains the photosynthetic part. So the part that is going to be collecting sunlight to turn it into sugar and oxygen. So in this case, the blade is divided into tiny little leaflets. So we have the frond, and the photosynthetic part is the blade. We have a stem, in this case of the tuberous sword fern. The stem, and with many ferns, happens to be underground. And from the stem arises a new leaf. And as the stem moves forward, and perhaps in this direction, a new leaf is going to push through the ground, emerging from the stem. So this is one leaf, in ferns referred to as frond. The blade is the photosynthetic part. The part of that leaf that holds the blade up into the air has a special name called the petiole. It's the leaf stalk or the leaf stem. It's not truly a stem, it's the leaf stalk, and it's called the petiole. Once the petiole enters into the blade, are you following me? We've got the petiole coming up from the stem, and the petiole is supporting the blade. As soon as the petiole enters into the blade, it changes name. And there's a reason. It's not, I didn't make this up, and it's certainly not my fault, but it's the truth. It changes name. So inside the blade, the petiole is then referred to as the rachis, or that mid-vein, or that mid-rib. The individual, if the blade is broken up into tiny little leaflets, those leaflets are referred to singularly as pinna, P-I-N-N-A. Together, they're referred to as pinnae, P-I-N-N-A-E. That's the plural. So these are just some weird fern words. You don't have to write these down. You don't have to memorize them, but just know that they exist. Know that you can look these words up, and you will have been told at least once today, you've been shown what these funny words refer to. Now, this happens to be a frond with a compound blade. The blade, the photosynthetic part of this single leaf, is divided into little leaflets. And what are the leaflets called? Pinna. Together, pinnae. Well done. Blades can be simple. So here we have the leaf stalk, called the petiole, and we have the blade, but the blade is not divided. This is just a very simple drawing. Here it is in real life, a real fern with a simple blade. So one leaf, you can see it's attached to the stem down here. If you can see my red laser pointer down here at the bottom of the slide. Yes, I think you can see that. The blade is entire, it's simple. It's not divided into those little leaflets, those little pinnae. And you can see the rachis is this nice midvein that runs right up through this simple blade. This is one of the bird nest ferns. We don't have these. We used to in Pinellas County. They've lost their favorite habitat, or they've been over collected out of the wild. But you can go visit these over at the Hillsborough River State Park, growing epiphytically, which means on the side of other plants, in this case, some species of oak. So my point, here we have bird's nest fern with a simple blade. Simple blade, single leaf, single frond, if you will. We have the petiole here, and then we have a compound blade. So this is a single leaf, everyone. We have a petiole, and then we have the blade, but the blade is broken up into little leaflets. And recall, in ferns, those leaflets are referred to as pinnae. The pinnae are, see, the pinnae in fern identification can have certain characteristics as a collective. So when you're reading a description of a fern, the description referred to as the pinnae as having a certain characteristics, a size, a shape, a color, a texture, that sort of thing. Individual pinna, so that's a pinna. These are all pinnae. Pinna could have a particular characteristic as well. So that's why we have these words, because they're used in identification. Now, to help you remember pinna and pinnae, the roots are the same as Latin for pin, which is pen. Feather pen, right? Feather. So if you think of it, we have what could be referred to as a feather-like leaf, a leaf that is broken down into these little component parts, just like feathers have these individual little side bits that are knitted together to form the whole. You'll be happy to know that in a feather, this central vein is called the rachis. So both in the plant world and the animal world, we have the same name for this central main vein that runs down the center. So the adjective for a fern leaf that is divided like a feather is pinnate. This is a pinnate frond. This frond, this leaf, in fact, this blade is pinnate. It's pinnately divided. It's divided like a feather. It's pinnately compound. Okay? I'm apologizing in advance because it gets a little bad, because sometimes fern fronds can be divided twice. They're referred to as bipinnate. A lot of people freak out on this part, so I'll go slow. we have the petiole, the little bit that holds up the blade. And then as soon as we encounter some photosynthetic material, the petiole changes name to rachis and runs up through the blade. This blade is divided twice. This whole blade, the whole photosynthetic part, is broken into this one leaflet here. And that leaflet is then broken again into individual little smaller leaflets. So it's compounded once and twice. If we took a little car and we drove it along the petiole, we took one left turn, that's once compound. We take a second left turn, that's twice compound or bipinnate. Of course they can be tripinnate. Of course, because they're ferns. You drive up the petiole, you make one left turn, once pinnate, two left turns, twice pinnate, turn left again, 3 times pinnate. So this whole blade of this single fern leaf can be divided all these times. But sometimes fern blades aren't broken into individual little parts. They're just very deeply lobed, as though they were about to turn into little tiny leaflets, but they never do. And of course, that has to have a word. That word is pinnatifid. It would be pinnate if it had only finished breaking off at the main rachis. So here we have very, very deeply lobed, but these lobes do not represent individual little leaflets. So this fern frond right here in front of us, this resurrection fern, is not referred to as pinnate. It's pinnatifid. I shouldn't even include this slide. There's a condition that's called pinnate pinnatifid. Let's move on from that. Let's have a sip of tea. No one's bailed yet. This is good news. Okay, what makes a fern a fern? If you'll recall, it's the parts of the fern associated with their life cycle is what makes a fern a fern. And recall that the fern life cycle, they reproduce by what? They use this thing that's been around long, long, long before seeds called spores. Well done. Here we have the underside of a very common fern, the widespread maiden fern. And we've taken that pinnatifid, see how lobed it is, but it's not coming all the way to the main vein, it's just deeply lobed. Anyway, we've got this leaf structure, and on the underside of the leaf, there are these little lumps, these little beads almost. And at a distance, these spots on the underside of a fern frond, people might refer to those as the spores. Each one of these little black dots or gold colored dots, those are what contain the spores. The spores you can never ever see. So this is the underside of a leaf. If we were to zoom up on one of these clusters, here's a really good picture of a golden foot polypody. Thank you, Wikimedia, for this incredibly in focus picture. And here's one spot on the underside of a fern frond, and this spot contains these spherical objects called the sporangia. And if you look really, really closely, you can see that these little spherical objects have these small little golden gems inside. There's 32 or 64 individual little spores inside each of these capsules. The capsule itself is a sporangia, and it's within the sporangia the spores are produced, and it's the sporangia that releases the spores. So do the math. Each one of these has 64 spores in it. multiply that over this one spot underneath one frond of one fern, multiply that over the entire fern frond, you can get an idea of how many spores are produced by an individual leaf of an individual population of a species of fern. Take a look at the sporangia. It has this funny little, it reminds me of a zipper, this little kind of striped structure. It's a little reinforced structure. What is the name of it? Annulus, I think it's called. So here's that stripy structure from the side. Two of those cells within the annulus are very, very weak. Side by side, they're very weak. And when the spores are ripe on the inside and when the environmental conditions are just right, those two cells pop and the annulus springs back and all those little spores that are inside the sporangium are released. And they drift out and go through the fern life cycle. Let's take a look at that step by step. So we have the sporangium. Remember this? We saw the cluster of sporangia, and there's that thing that reminds me of a zipper. And the two little cells that are particularly weak, they break, and the little sporangia kind of coughs out these microscopic spores, single cells that are capable of growing into an entirely new plant. When these spores, each one of these, if and when they land on a suitable substrate where they can grow, the little spores germinate and they grow into a brand new plant. It doesn't look like a fern. It's just part of the fern life cycle. It's a separate plant. It's separate from the original plant. This is what a spore grows into. This is called the prothallus. And it's about a quarter the size of your pinky nail. I don't care how big your pinky nail is because there's a lot of diversity in ferns, but it's a small structure, only a few cell layers thick. So the spore germinates and grows into this tiny little thing. It's heart-shaped. If you, in a perfect world, if you were to take that structure and lay it flat and put it under a microscope, this is what you would see. You could count the individual cells in this thing. It's small. It's got some cellular kind of outgrowths that help it to hang on to whatever substrate it's in. And the prothallus, here it is growing out in its substrate. Here, a drawing of the thing. And on the underside, it has one or two of these specialized little organs that are called archegonia and antheridia. The ladies and the boys. The lady parts, the archegonia, they have egg cells inside. And the antheridia, we're talking about plants, egg cells. The antheridia, antheridium or antheridia plural, they produce special cells called sperm. And the sperm cells swim. Remember, these guys, right now, they don't have any vascular tissue. There's no roots or stems going on here. So the rainwater washes over this structure, picks up sperm from one prothallus, swims through that layer of water, swims into the archegonia to find the egg. And when the sperm and the egg are united, they form a fern. And the fern, the fertilized embryo, begins to grow. This is our old prothallus. It's going to wither and die away. Its job is done. It produced the structures that made the cells. And then one of those egg cells germinates and grows into the next adult fern to produce the next generation of spores. It's an alternation of generations. It's two separate plants. The big one that we can see that produces the spores, and the tiny little one that produces the important sex cells that once one egg is fertilized will then produce this new fern. So here we have the prothallus that's going to disappear because now that egg has been fertilized and that egg is going to grow into the adult fern. And that adult fern is going to make some proper roots and so on. Isn't that cool? This has been going on a lot longer than since well before there were dinosaurs. This was sorted out long before dinosaurs or anything else, or any animal had sorted out its reproduction. Ferns have been going through this kind of clunky but extremely obviously efficient life cycle. True of all the ferns. So no matter what fern you're looking at, it's going to produce the sporangia, the spores, the prothallus, the Antheridia archegonia, sperm and egg cells. Fertilized egg becomes the next sporangia, sporophyte that produces the sporangia and so on. Okay, so what do we do with all this crazy information? How does that help? Well, as we talked about, all the different parts of the leaf have names and conditions, and pinna and pinnae and rachis and petiole. We can use all these words, all these conditions of all these parts in identifying ferns. Here we have an invasive exotic fern. We're going to look at this one several times today because I really would love it if you could identify this one. And if you can identify the tuberous sword fern, perhaps you could eliminate it from, again, your sphere of influence. Here we have a human finger in the background for scale. You see, it goes from here to here, and you can kind of see the fingerprint. So we have a pinnate fern frond. Here we have the rachis. Remember, that's the central stem, the central vein that runs down the middle. An individual pinna, the little leaflets. And if you'll look, these leaflets, the base of these leaflets overlap the rachis. You see that? They're overlapping the rachis. That is an identification for this species of sword fern, the invasive exotic. So overlapping overlapping pinna bases or leaflet bases, kidney-shaped groups of sporangia. So this is not one sporangia. This is, remember, when we zoomed in, we saw 50 little sporangia. They're all clustered into this kidney-shaped structure. So we've got a couple of characters based on the shape of the reproductive structures, the fact that the pinnae overlap the rachis. You see how the vocabulary starts to move in? Zooming in, a collection of sporangia has a name, of course. It has to. This is botany. It's called the sorus. Together, sorus are called sori. Blah-de, blah-de, blah. I've told you these words. Like I said, you don't have to know them, but you've been exposed to them. And if you needed to look it up, oh yeah, I've heard that once before. So a group of sporangia, a spot on the back of the leaf, is referred to as a sorus. Together, those sorus are referred to collectively as sori. And if you look closely, there's a thin little membrane. Maybe you can just make that out. These are those kidney-shaped groups of sporangia that I pointed to on the previous slide. Yeah, the kidney-shaped bits. Here's a little bit closer, and you can see that little membrane that's covering them. Of course, the membrane has to have a name. The name of the membrane is an indusium. The indusium can be present or it can be absent. The indusium kind of protects the developing sporangia. And this is a completely different species than the one that we saw close up before, but you can see the reproductive structures are identical. Here we have that annular ring that envelops the sporangia that has the 64 little spores inside. The sporangia, remember we've seen this before, the sporangia could have characteristics that help identify the fern. They could have a color. In this case, in this fern, this is an exotic. I think this is the leather fern that's used a lot in the flower, cut flowers or whatever. Immature, they're kind of green color, but when they mature, they turn color. The indusium is protecting all these sporangia, is very, very large and well-defined, and it's actually green, it's actually photosynthetic. So this fern has quite a few characters that can be used in its identification. The little pinna has got teeth along the edge. The indusium is very round. It's not kidney shaped. The sporangia are black. So all these little characters that are associated with the parts of this fern can help make a proper identification. So here's a fern with, obviously, with an indusium. We'll go back to our goldenfoot, excuse me, our goldenfoot polypody that we saw before. They don't have an indusium. This species does not produce that protective covering for its developing sporangia. Here it is from a distance. We have the goldenfoot polypody. It's the one behind me here with very well-spaced golden clusters of sporangia. And close up, they look like that. From a distance, you can just do the math on how many each one of these individual sori, each one of these individual clusters of sporangia, very good, how many spores are produced by just this one leaf? The location where the sporangia, where the sori, or those collections of sporangia, are produced on the leaf can be diagnostic. In this case, they're round, and they're located between the central vein of the pinna and the margin of the pinna. So kind of equidistant between there and there. In an immature leaf, when these aren't quite ready yet, you can still see where they're going to be. So if the identification guide is asking you or telling you that the sori are produced midway between the central vein and the edge of the leaflet or pinna, you can see they will be in future. You can kind of see where they're going to develop. One of our native species, the swamp fern, produces all of its sporangia right down the middle vein of each one of the pinna. And that is unique to this species in Central Florida. No other fern's going to do this. So that one characteristic can get you the identification of this particular fern. The sporangia are all crowded along that central vein of each individual pinna coming off the rachis of the swamp fern. The bracken fern, the sporangia are produced along the edges of each one of those little leaflets, each one of those little pinna, but not the tips. See that? These probably broke off. So generally speaking, these sporangia are produced along the edges, but not the tips. So again, that can be used in identification of bracken, along with a lot of other characteristics. Some ferns produce the same plant, the same individual plant produces two different shaped fronds, such as the case with the netted chain fern. They have sterile fronds and fertile fronds. The sterile fronds are for photosynthesis. The netted chain fern produces these nice apple green, fleshy, semi-succulent, pinnatifid fronds. These are sterile. If you were to flip this frond over, there would never be any sori. There would never be a sporangia. These are sterile. These are purely photosynthetic. The fertile fronds, produced by the same plant, have a different job. They're individual little lobes, because these are just lobes of a pinnatifid frond. They're reduced. They're not doing much photosynthesis at all. The job of the fertile frond is to produce the sporangia. And if you'll note the shape of these two different fronds produced by the same plant, the shape suggests the job that they do. The solar collecting fronds are laying horizontally to the ground to maximize their exposure to sunlight. The fertile fronds are much taller and they stick up into the atmosphere, and their reduced fronds, packed with sporangia, absolutely packed with sporangia, are ready to release the spores into the air. Spores are air transmitted. They are air dispersed. They are wind dispersed. In order for this netted chain fern to contribute to the future of its genetics, to keep its population stable, it's got to produce a single offspring in its lifetime. One for one. So it produces billions of spores over its lifetime. And fingers or fronds crossed, one of those spores will develop into an adult that will then release spores for the next generation. So the fertile frond in the case of the netted chain fern has got a very stiffly erect frond that's going to send those spores to chance into the wind. Kind of a dramatic example of this two different kinds of fronds is the cinnamon fern, where the sterile frond is very fern-like, but it surrounds they're kind of a vase-shaped fern, and it surrounds this fertile frond, which if you use your imagination, you can tell that these are packed with little sporangia, tiny little sporangia, and each one of them with 64 spores and billions on this one stalk. The color is cinnamon, giving this plant its name, the cinnamon fern. Some ferns have fronds that look the same from one another. Some happen to have spores on or sporangia on, and others just don't, such is the case with the giant leather fern. Ferns have this really cool way of unrolling. It has a funny name. It's circinate vernation. They uncurl. It's just kind of primordial the way that these ferns tend to grow. All right, with a sip of water, we're just gonna crush on through, introduce you to the ferns of Pinellas County that you might encounter in natural areas. There's a lot of ornamental ferns that we won't be covering today. A lot of people grow, the staghorn ferns and the macho ferns, and then this and that fern. We'll find the ones that you can actually see growing in natural areas, be they native or not. So we'll start the ferns of Pinellas. Here are the species. In what used to be alphabetical order, but of course there have been some name changes since this was originally produced. The ones with the asterisks are invasive exotics. So we'll pay a little bit closer attention to these. If you have these in your sphere of influence, we would love it if you would take measures to remove them properly, dispose of them properly, and teach other people about how wonderful our native ferns are and how troublesome these other ferns are and how to safely eradicate them. The giant leather fern. Okay, this picture was taken at John Chestnut Park. Here's a hand railing over the wetland. So the tree canopy here is bay trees and cypress. It's a freshwater wetland. This hand railing is probably 10 feet from the ground where this fern is rooted. So this frond, this single frond, is about 12 or 15 feet tall. It is a real giant. And it produces fertile fronds, entirely fertile fronds that look exactly like the sterile fronds, but they have this rust color on the underside because each one of these little pinnules, pinnae, are covered in sporangia. So billions and billions and billions of spores. One of our floating ferns, this one's native, the mosquito fern. People call it duckweed. There are many tiny little, almost microscopic floating plants that people refer to as duckweed. For scale, this in the background is a pine needle. So very, very small. What makes this a fern? Its reproductive sporangia, prothallus, and all that gear. Floating on the water. This one is found throughout the northern hemisphere, very, very widespread. It's an ancient thing. It's one of the things that's been found in amber from, hundreds of millions of years ago. This is a plant that can take atmospheric nitrogen, that means nitrogen in the air, and change it in such a way and then release it into the surroundings that in a form that plants can then pick up. So this is actually encouraged. This is a plant that's cultivated with rice, where rice is grown in freshwater paddies. This fern is introduced because it makes natural fertilizer for the developing rice plants. We met the swamp fern earlier. The new growth of the swamp fern is this lovely bronzy kind of reddish brown color. You can see the individual little pinnae. So this is a pinnatifid. Once divided, we're driving up the rachis and we make one turn. It's once divided. It's simply pinnate. It's the one that has the sporangia produced right along that mid vein. Here you can see all those little sporangia crowded right along the mid vein. Cerulatum, because the edges of these pinna are serrated like a steak knife. You can see it's a bit shiny, very upstanding. This is a picture of one. This is one that's going to be growing in seasonally flooded areas. It can be aquatic. It can grow submerged in water during the rainy season and above ground during the wintertime. It's evergreen, putting on its new foliage around the beginning of the wet season. So it just started putting up its new growth about a month ago. It has kind of an exaggerated, if you will, final, ultimate pinna here at the very tip of the leaf. It's kind of an expressive pinna that points straight up in the air. Ooh, the climbing Japanese climbing fern and the New World climbing fern. These are trouble. These are true ferns and they grow like vines. They're loose throughout the Southeast United States. They're displacing our native species by growing over them, shading them out, killing them. Ferns, of course, reproducing by spores that are carried in the wind. So these things can get, their spores can get carried very far and wide. They found their ways throughout the Southeast along railroads. And then once they were established along railroads, they blew into gardens and woodlands and so on. So they're pretty well established throughout the Southeast, the climbing ferns are. The fronds are very unusual. They have these kind of hand-shaped pinnules, and the warty edges of these lobes are where the sporangia are located. If you find a plant that's climbing like a vine, but is producing those, if you have a hand lens, you can spot, if you see those sporangia, you've got a climbing fern, and it's definitely worth getting rid of, or seeking help for a proper identification and advice on how to best get rid of it. The tuberous sword fern is everywhere. Some people call this Boston fern. You can still buy it. You can buy tuberous sword fern, invasive, exotic, category 1, top of the list, bad guy in our native areas. This is one that's found everywhere. It comes up in between pavers, on the sidewalk. It grows up in the boots of non-native palm trees. This is actually labeled in a botanic garden, but I've seen wild areas, natural areas where the entire forest floor is covered in tuberous sword fern. Why is it called tuberous? Because if you were to dig some of it up, you would find these underground tubers. Unique in this part of the world. And none of our native ferns are going to have these underground water storage and reproductive structures. So if you have this plant in your sphere of influence, get rid of it. Help us out. This is the one where the individual pinna overlap the rachis and has those kidney-colored sori. The indusia covering the sori are kidney-shaped. So those characteristics together might help identify the tuberous sword fern. Cinnamon fern, native, happy, very good, makes a good garden plant, very stately. Unlike most of our native ferns, it does not have that underground stem that creeps along, sending up a frond here and there and here and there and here and there. All the fronds originate from a central crown area. So it makes these kind of individual vase-shaped plants with the leaves originating from a central point. And from the very, very center of that cone-shaped arrangement of fronds emerges once or twice a year the fertile fronds that give it its name, the cinnamon fern. Those cinnamon stick. It's not the source of the spice cinnamon, it's just the same color that gives it its name. In the absence of the fertile fronds, making it obviously a cinnamon fern, if you were to just have these sterile fronds, they look pretty ferny, they look pretty run-of-the-mill fern. So if in the absence of the fertile fronds, if you only have the sterile fronds, if you were to flip one of them over, of course, you're not going to find any sporangia there because these are the sterile fronds, but right where the first division off the rachis, right where that first division leaves, there's a little tuft of cinnamon-colored hairs. We call these the hairy armpits of the cinnamon fern. So check for that in helping you identify a cinnamon fern. It has a cousin, the royal fern. The royal fern also has two different frond types. Here we have the fertile, so the individual little leaflets or pinnae are reduced to nothing more than being the bearers of little sporangia, but it's not the whole frond, it's just the top third. So if you look at this picture here, we have kind of a normal frond, and then just the very tip is given over to that reproductive structure. Here's one out here at Brooker Creek. The fronds are very large. They're twice compound. You can see the pinnules are very, very well spaced out. So everything about it is big. I think that's how it got the name royal. My favorite, the golden foot polypody. If you see in the background of this photograph, it's the boots or the leaf bases of a cabbage palm. Those kind of maybe horseshoe-shaped structures that represent the leaf bases, the frond bases of the cabbage palm. That is prime habitat for the golden foot polypody. It has a very large pinnatifid frond. We met this one earlier. This is the one that has those very macroscopic and well-spaced sori that we zoomed in on and saw all the individual little sporangia. It's called golden foot because the stem, the growing stem, is covered in these golden scales. And the tip of that stem, as it grows forward and produces individual little fronds all around the stem, as it grows forward, it looks something like a little rabbit's foot. So there's the golden foot of the golden foot polypody. If you've ever met a rabbit's foot fern, it's kind of the same idea. You've got this scaly little stem tip. As it grows forward, it's covered in those protective scales. The resurrection fern, which has gone through, in my botanical career since 1985 or 6, it has had 3 name changes. I don't know if we're up for any more. The resurrection fern, an epiphytic fern. So it uses its roots to hang on. It hangs on. It's not a parasite. It's just growing along tree branches, trying to get a foothold and get its fronds out into the sun. After a rain, the resurrection fern is very lush and green, and you can see the bough of this tree festooned with the nice lush growth of the resurrection fern. But those roots are just being used to hang on to the tree bark, and tree barks don't hold much water. Water tends to shed off a tree bark. So once the rain is stopped, the resurrection fern doesn't have much access to much more water, and it shrivels up. It doesn't die, but it might as well be. It certainly does look dead. When rain falls again, it rehydrates these shriveled up fronds, and again, they swell into their lush glory, giving it its name, the resurrection fern. Bracken fern is one of the few ferns that you'll find in very, very, very dry conditions. Upland, sandy, hot, sunny, palmettos, grasses, bracken. It's got a very complicated frond structure. It's divided 3 times, and then individual fronds, individual little leaflets might have, if you can see kind of closely, excuse me, this leaflet has got this ultimate lobe that's very, very long, and then the kind of auxiliary lobes are just kind of suggestions. Funny thing, kind of unmistakable if you find a fern growing up out of the ground, very, very stiff and sturdy, probably about 1 meter tall, very, very stiff, resistant to wilt, is the bracken fern. One of our floating ferns, let's forget the mosquito fern that we met first of all, the azolla, but another floating fern, this one. Again, we met this one with the egg beater shaped scales on the underside, which is actually facing up of this floating fern. This is salvinia, or water spangles. True duckweed is represented by this plant here with the 3 lobes. You see, nothing is overlapping. It's just a single plant with the 3 lobes. The plant with the overlapping scales is our mosquito fern, but this large one, again, each one of these leaves are about the size of a pinky nail. This is an imported fern that's kind of choking out our natural areas. So if you have a wetland and you have water spangles, do some research on the best way to eradicate yourself of this invasive exotic, and make sure you know the difference between water spangles and native duckweed and native mosquito fern. Couple of maiden ferns. Maiden ferns are a very, very widespread. There's actually one that's referred to as the widespread maiden fern. Of the maiden ferns, of the group of ferns that are referred to as the maiden ferns, there's 1,000 species worldwide. There's 21 different ones in North America, 16 different in Florida with our temperate, medium, and tropical zones, but there's only 3 in Pinellas. And I think there's a couple of conditions, a couple of characters that can help you identify the different species of these maiden ferns. The maiden ferns have a very broadly triangular frond in outline. So you have these pinna that come off of the rachis, and then the pinna are lobed. So the individual pinna are lobed like that, kind of like teeth. The interrupted fern, or the Hottentot fern, that chain of sporangia right along the edge there is interrupted at the tip of that lobe. The ultimate lobing of a single leaf comes to kind of this abrupt and acute point. That's kind of characteristic of the maiden ferns. If you want to get really serious, hold one of these up to the light, one of these here, just an individual pinna. And if you look in between the 2 lobes, 1 lobe, 2 lobe of those pinna, you've got a vein coming from this lobe, and from this lobe, the 2 veins meet and then run into the sinus together as that single vein. That's characteristic of the Hottentot fern, or the interrupted maiden fern. The southern shield is probably the most widespread. Another name for this one is the widespread maiden fern. It has the characteristics of the maiden ferns, of very broadly triangular in outline, but an abrupt tip to the entire frond. You see how it just comes to a very acute tip. The secret for this one is not only the fact that the adjacent veins come off from the lowest point of side-by-side lobes and meet or never meet. They gaze at each other wistfully from either side of the sinus. You see, they're on this side and on this side. They never meet and run into the sinus together. That's one characteristic. Without a hand lens, the widespread maiden fern is covered in white hairs. So white hairs, widespread. White hairs, widespread. If you know you're looking at the widespread maiden fern. It's very widespread. If you see this kind of apple green, meter tall, it's pinnate pinnatifid. So the rachis breaks off into individual little leaflets. Those leaflets are then pinnatifid, deeply lobed. And finally the marsh fern of the maiden ferns. Again, in the background, you can see some aquatic plants giving you an idea of where you're going to find this maiden fern, Thelipterus palustris. Palustris means it grows in the swamp. This one's got tuning fork shaped veins underneath. So again, if it's that important to you, these things can be determined. If all you need to know is that you're looking at some sort of maiden fern, look for that broad triangular outline with a very tapered, quickly narrowed, tapered tip and a pinnate, pinnatifid, frond division. So one leaf is divided into individual leaflets. Those individual leaflets are pinnatifid, deeply lobed. Here we have a picture of those tuning forks up close. Not making this stuff up. The veins are bifurcate, once bifurcate into that little tuning fork shape. What used to be called Woodwardia is now Lawrenceria, if you care. This is the one, this is the netted chain fern. This is the classic pinnatifid leaf arrangement here. The sterile fronds being very deeply lobed, but not completely becoming individual little leaflets. This is the one we saw with the sterile frond that went straight up in the air and had very, very narrow leaf divisions because they're more for producing those sporangia. Here's one at Brooker. You can see they can be quite fleshy. They arch, they're a clear apple green color, very distinctive when you see those in the wild. What's netted about them, if you were, again, to take your hand lens, you could see the veins underneath are kind of, they make these little delineations called areoles. So instead of branching all the way out to the edge, you get these discrete little areoles. Here you can see in a different lighting where all sides of these sections are surrounded by vein tissue. And we'll finish up with another former Woodwardia, the Virginia chain fern. Now the Virginia chain fern can be very similar to the cinnamon fern. They have a pinnate pinnatifid frond, each frond being about 1 meter tall. The Virginia chain fern, on the other hand, does not grow from that central crown like the cinnamon fern does. Rather, it has one of those creeping underground stems. So you'll see Virginia chain fern frond coming up here and there and here and there. The petiole, the leaf stem, and indeed in many cases the rachis itself, but almost always the petiole here is dark mahogany brown, almost black. So I remember Virginia chain fern, you know, an old house in Virginia with mahogany furniture, maybe. I don't know, whatever works. That mahogany petiole of the Virginia chain fern. Another is the arrangement on the underside of the fertile fronds. The sporangia, they can't be stopped. They follow along the mid vein, they go up into the little lobes and back down along the mid vein and up into the lobes and so on and so on and so on. Also, the underside of these leaves is kind of silvery. here you can see it in better light. If you were to hold it up, not only can you notice all the coverage of the sporangia, but that silver sheen of the Virginia chain fern. And don't let anyone tell you that ferns are very tender and weak and need to be coddled or tended very carefully. We had a fire up here at Brooker a couple of years ago, and 3 days after the fire was out, one of the first plants to grow was the Virginia chain fern. And here it is, busting through burnt ground with its friend here, a blade of grass. So tough as nails are ferns. I hope this introduction to some of the familiar species that you might find in our natural areas has been what you were looking for and what you had expected when you signed up for this class. Would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much. We have our series, our Florida Supernature series that we've been presenting every Wednesday at 2 o'clock. We have that memorialized, if you will, recorded on our YouTube channel. The address for that YouTube channel is right here. It's bit.ly/FL Supernature. That link should take you to our YouTube page where you can find recordings of all the webinars that we have produced over the past couple of months or so. Again, use the email address here under my name or the one up on the slide if you have any questions, comments, complaints, rebuttals, and so forth. We're going to take a week or two off and send everyone who's ever registered for any of our webinars a link to our upcoming offerings, what we hope to do next. So you don't have to. We'll be going outside and talking about what's going on out in the summertime, up here in the preserve, in the wetlands, in the uplands, in the swamp, literally in the swamp, in the flatlands, flatwoods, and so on. So we're going to hopefully bring you some more natural resource conservation information and infotainment, as it were. So again, thank you for joining us today. I'm running 7 minutes over. I appreciate your patience and time. And I'll leave this slide up for just a few minutes so you can take down the information. But thank you again for joining us today and hope to see you very, very soon.